Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 90 of the Solosaurus podcast. I'm your host, Michael Eckenfels, and thank you to absolutely everyone, and I mean everyone, for your support, your kind words, and for listening, and especially thanks to Martin Gonzalez for being the logistics boss behind the scenes, keeping us going. He is the one who paid the bills to keep our Libsyn account live, and thank you very much for doing that and for continuing to do that. Really appreciate his efforts in that regard. Also, like I said, appreciate you guys for listening, appreciate the feedback, appreciate everything on Facebook. If you're not on the Facebook group, please feel free to go over there and like it. It is just go to Facebook and search for Solosaurus. It's really the main way that I can communicate with you guys. Now, we do have an email, of course. It is solosauruspodcast@gmail.com. And I've been actually worked really hard a couple of weeks ago to go through all the backlog and write people back who wrote us like a year ago. And I think I've got caught up completely. And I even reached out to some other folks as well, some developers, some publishers. As you know, I've got a few things in the hopper for review purposes. But today's episode is not going to be about any one single game. It's going to be about solo wargaming. And those of you who don't like that, you might listen anyway, just because it might be something interesting for you. Or you just want to hear me blather, you can certainly do that. You're welcome to, of course, anytime. Any previous episode, go for it. So this particular episode, like I said, solo wargaming, I'm going to envision this as being sort of a three-parter. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to do the next two episodes like this. I'm envisioning in a second episode having a friend of mine on who is also a solo wargamer person who has a channel where he talks about solo wargaming. And I can tell you what that is. It's called My Own Worst Enemy, which I think is the best name possible for any kind of solo gaming channel. It's just awesome because it's true. You know, you're your own worst enemy when it comes to solo gaming. And this guy is great. So I reached out to him, and I think I will have him on here in a few months. I'm not sure exactly when. And then the third part will be a game developer, designer. I've been talking to some people, and I believe I've got one lined up. So I'll leave that a surprise, though. If you're interested in solo wargaming, you'll definitely be interested in that episode as well. So it's going to be all solo gaming, not all the time, of course. Other things I'm going to talk about, not just solo wargames, but in this episode, yes, solo wargames. Sorry, I don't want to be confusing. I know I am being. Been posting on Facebook with some of the acquisitions. Halls of Hagra came for review. The publisher of that one reached out to me, Tompet Games, and said, "Hey, you want a copy of it? Welcome back." I'm like, "Hey, yeah, of course. I would love one. It's a pure solo one-the game, perfect for our channel." I got Legacy of You. Received Legacy of You. Sorry. I'm trying not to say got. You know, I used to be a technical writer, and I had a friend of mine I worked with, and she got so annoyed whenever I said the word got. And so I, as a result, having done that for years, now get really triggered whenever I hear the word got, especially in shows like America's Got Talent. Oh, drives me crazy. But anyway, not the subject of this podcast. Let's see. Let's go ahead and jump into some things, though. Well, first, we're going to talk about some solo news, but I'm seeing this as solo and Solosaurus news. So sort of a solo squared news, I guess. That's kind of maybe that's a thing I'll go with. I don't know. So first, let's look at the news as brought to us by solitairetimes.net. It looks like there's been a couple of updates since I last looked at this. Watch Your Back week September 17 to 23 and Watch Your Back week September 24 to 23. So let's look at 17 to 23 first and see what we've got. So looks like we've got quite a few things to look at. And in fact, the person who writes this article says, "Boy, do we have a lot on our crowdfunding plate today. Let's get started." And the first one is something called Creature Caravan, a 1 to 6 player tableau building game in which you are trying to help the creatures you carry in your caravan escape to safer grounds. That sounds cool. That sounds like Endangered, and I really like Endangered. You will be activating cards by placing dice, trading for goods in the market, and fighting zombies along the way. That's an interesting thing to add zombies to a animal. I wonder if they're animal zombies. Well, the Game Found campaign on on September 18th, so that is already a thing. This is September 24th as I record this, so it's been a thing for a week now, so you want to head over there and check it out if you're not aware of it. This also includes The World of Arzium. The World of Arzium RPG and a new edition of Islebound. Next we have September 18th, also kicked off on Kickstarter, a game called Bone Wars, which is a 1-to-4 player hand management and worker placement game in which paleontologists dig for dinosaur bones to compete for fame. That sounds great. I like the sound of that. Digging for dinosaur bones. It's always kind of a cool little thing. When I play a lot of mobile games on my phone, I'll often see an advertisement for something that looks interesting, and I'll tap on it, download it, try it for a bit. There's a lot of games along those lines, and I do like them, but nothing that's really scratched the itch, so to speak. So maybe this is a good one. You will be discovering fossils, publishing papers, and trying to outdo your opponents. There is no info on the solo mode yet. Okay, well, it says 1-to-4 players, so there's going to be a solo mode. I wonder if that will be a tacked on. Personal opinion, according to this website, is it doesn't sound well suited to solo play. And I would have to agree with that. Without actually having the solo component out there, ready to go to announce it to the world, let's just kind of take that with a grain of salt. The next one, 2 small soloable games, Sirens and Defrag, are launching September 19th. So those should be live by now too. On Kickstarter, both support 1-to-2 players. Sirens is a card drafting game in which you are playing against the Orpheus AI. You will choose cards to place in your tableau to form a song. Oh, that's cool. With matching symbols on the cards. In Defrag, you are trying to put together file fragments in your 1995 computer by arranging cards in a grid. Oh, Defrag. The days of defragging. I don't know if any of y'all are old enough to remember that. If you remember back in my day when we did Defrag to clear out a freaking C drive to make it run more smoothly. I mean, the process of installing and uninstalling and installing and uninstalling constantly on a hard drive back in those days is it would just leave detritus, I guess is the best word for it, just like little crumbs around, and defragging a hard drive was necessary to kind of clean it out and make it run more smoothly. And that sounds really interesting to me. I like the sound of that. But let's move on to the Watch Your Back week, September 24th to 30th. And see what we have here, because there was something I saw. Yep, here it is. Forage, a 9-card solitaire game to add to your collection. This is by a guy named Mark Tuck. He's got a couple out there already, small dice games. One's called Orchard and one's called Grove. I don't have Grove, but I do have Orchard, and I can thank Anthony for that. Anthony from the BG41 group over on Facebook. I highly recommend them if you're not a member over there. Go check them out. They're great. Anthony posted something about that, and I thought, oh, that's really cool. And so I ordered it, and it's just this little, like a tuck sleeve, like a box big enough for playing cards, and there's some dice in there too, and it's just really neat. It's completely portable and easy to play, but the strategy to it is much, much deeper than the actual game looks like. And this sounds like it's something adding on to that. So besides the usual beat your own score mode, let me start that. Let me start this front of that paragraph. In this game, you will be foraging for blackberries. That is forage. Blackberries, chestnuts, and mushrooms in the forest. Besides the usual beat your own score mode, there we go. This time you have the option of playing the recipe mode, which has a win-lose condition. Once again, you will be placing down cards trying to overlap the same patterns. If you succeed, you place a die on the matching square. So if you don't, you place a die with a mouse, and that subtracts 2 points from your score. Launching on Kickstarter September 25th, so that's tomorrow, actually. If I get this uploaded today on the 24th, then there you go. You got that to look forward to. I probably will not back it just because, I'm kind of out of the radar, off the radar. That kind of thing's off my radar. There we go. I can say it right. Just because I'm, I've done my part for crowdfunded games now, and I'm still waiting on like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of them. So I've got a ways to wait. So there is that. Now for Solosaurus news, the second part of the squared version, I guess, of this. Nothing much to report there other than I am seeking a new sponsor, and it's not anything against Stone Valley Games, might ask, well, why don't you just go back to them? Well, they moved on to another podcast provider, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I totally understand it, considering Martin and I just kind of went dark and nothing happened. He moved on to another podcaster. No problem at all. If you've ordered from Stone Valley Games in the past, and you like them, please do. They're class acts. I've myself spent much more money than I probably should have at them, at their store. And I always had great service with them, never had a problem with it. So, continue that if that's your thing. If not, totally understand. It doesn't matter. Either way, they're great. If you want to, if you even heard of them or if you never ordered from them, I encourage you to go check them out. But I am working with another couple, actually. I have a couple in the works. I don't know which one I'm landing on yet, so I'm kind of loath to say which one it is at this time. But as soon as I do, I'll let you know. I've already got Eric Summerer. Thank you, Eric, to you for doing our intro to the show as well. He's going to do a new recording for us to reflect that new sponsor. So that's awesome as well. Still happy to be part of the Dice Tower Network. Happy to see that our episode's actually deployed there, so that's good. All right, so we have been in this now for 11 minutes. Go figure. You would think that just by myself I've got nothing really to say or talk about, but I've already wasted. I've already talked for 12 minutes, so let's move on to what we're going to be talking about in this episode, and that's solo wargaming. But first, always a but first, I want to make sure that I kind of lay the groundwork and lay the foundation for this. So we're going to talk about what is solo gaming from my perspective, what is wargaming from another perspective, and then we can dive into what I want to discuss. And it's just going to be this random collection. I've got an organization of sorts, but I feel that this is kind of a rabbit hole. So I can sit here and I can list every single game I want to talk about. I could sit here and talk across 1,000 episodes and not scratch the surface. Quite literally, and I hate using the word literally, and there I go. But so you know what I mean. It's there's so much to it, and I'm going to try to hit the high points in this particular episode without spending 6 hours doing it. So first, let's talk about what is solo gaming. You know what solo gaming is. It's one person. Michael, what are you talking about? This doesn't make any sense. Well, it is. It is, absolutely. Solo gaming is one person. But what is a solo game, though? So in that particular vein, there's tiers, I think. And the tiers are from the most solo-friendly to the least solo-friendly. But that doesn't mean you can't play it solo. So what is a solo game? The answer is quite simple. It's any game. Any game at all. Seriously, any game, if there's a will, there's a way to play it solo. Even games with hidden trader mechanisms, things like that, it's very easy to solo them. And Board Game Geek is a fantastic resource for that, because you will find games that are verses that have, most likely, somebody's created a solo mode for it, and that's pretty cool. I've been in the past of the mind that such modes they're not official, so I'm not interested. But that's changed, in my opinion, more and more in the last, say, 10 years of this hobby, because there's a lot of creative people out there, and it's awesome. And sometimes those become official. It's interesting to know. There's a guy named Stuka Joe, for instance. He's got a fantastic channel as well. If you go check him out, he does a lot of great solo wargaming stuff. And he has created a card-driven system that is on sale over at GMT Games. That there's two versions of it, a 1 and a 2, that can be played with GMT titles that help you drive a game. Now, some of them are not fully soloable in that you're playing against a bot. It's not how that works. It's just kind of giving you choices to make, or limiting your choices so you have more of a control over the game, rather than having too many to choose from. You can just say, okay, I've got these 3 cards, I can choose from one of them instead of from 5 cards or more. So I kind of went off track there. Sorry about that. What else is new? We do that. At least I didn't talk about aliens, right? So let me mention what those tiers are. So the first tier, top of the line, top of the heap, is games designed to be solo, period. No multiplayer component to it. Multiplayer and co-op modes are not even in the running at all. It's just a solo game, period. Those are the best. And there's several of those for wargaming, like Halls of Hagar, for instance. That one is actually a solo-only game, and that's just one example off the top of my head because it's sitting right here next to me. After that, you have games designed for 1+ players. So any game that's 1 to 4, 1 to 5, 1 to 6, whatever along those lines. They might be intended to be multiplayer games, but they have very strong solo element to them. The solo element might have been something they built first, and then they added the multiplayer component to it later. That is probably just above the next layer, which is 1 to 4, 1 to 5, 1 to 6 player games where the solo mode is just kind of tacked on. You know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of games like that out there. Then you can go to co-op games a little bit further down. Now, the intent of those is, of course, to have multiple players working together. That's where the fun is in completing a common goal. But they can be soloed. And in fact, if the thing is, though, about those and why they're lower on the tier list to me is because you can cheat, of course. I mean, that's the whole intent, is working together with a larger group to have a specific outcome, winning the game. Whereas you're doing it by yourself, you're of the mindset of every single player, and you know what's going to happen, and you can make everybody cooperate perfectly. You know that doesn't always happen in multiplayer games. Maybe that's why you're a solo player too. Who knows? But you know what I mean. So there's that. And then below that, you have cooperative games, but then say something with a traitor element or some kind of hidden mechanism to it. Something like Mansions of Madness, 2nd edition, comes to mind right there. Oh, no, not Mansions of Madness. I'm sorry. Betrayal at House on the Hill. I don't know why I get those two mixed up in my head. Betrayal at House on the Hill. You start off exploring this creepy mansion, and then suddenly somebody turns traitor in the middle of it, and they have a hidden goal. I think there's a way to solo that. I want to say I would almost bet 80% chance that BGG's got some kind of solo mode to that. But then past that layer, you're going into versus games, and then you're going into versus games with hidden information, and it becomes a lot more cloudy and more murky when it comes to being a solo player. So it's a little more difficult. But that said, it doesn't mean it's impossible. So versus games really are war games. There's a lot of war games that are versus, say, Axis and Allies, World in Flames. There's several. I mean, I'm just a couple off the top of my head. I can look to my right here. I've got a bookcase full of solitaire war games. Actually, there's no good example there for multiplayer games, but I grew up playing these kinds of things where you had multiple sides. That became more second nature to me to play that way. Playing multi-handed might be something that does not appeal to you at all, and I totally understand that. It does take some effort to train yourself to look at things that way. But it's helped me too in a lot of ways, even in my career as an instructional designer, helping me have empathy, helping me see how somebody in another position would see things, and that is a useful thing to have in a way of making your brain think. So that could be a good exercise for you. But those are basically the tiers that I wanted to discuss. I've been wanting to talk about that for a while. I just never really kind of got to it. You might agree, you might disagree. If you got any thoughts, please share them with everybody on the Facebook group. Next, what is a war game? You would be surprised at how much of a discussion this can bring up online. Some people are going to say things like Axis and Allies is not a war game, or this is not a war game, that's not a war game, this is a war game, that's a war game. What's a war game? It's whatever you think it is, to be honest. I've said on this show before, I do not like labels on games, and I don't really, because it's open to interpretation. What's a Euro game? What's a Ameritrash game? I don't like those labels, just because a game is a game to me. It's fun or it's not, or it's kind of mediocre. It's, there's all kinds of layers to it. So indeed, a war game is whatever you want to think of a war game. A lot of people think of it as a combat type game, and it can be. It could be other things too. There could be any kind of measure of conflict in it as describing a war game. I mean, it's whatever you think it is. If you go Google solo war games, if you Google Solitaire War Games BGG, that kind of a thing, you're going to get tons and tons of lists to look at. If you go to the Solitaire War Games group on Facebook, which is a good group if you're interested in this kind of thing, they're enablers, so be careful. Should I get this game? Yes, you should. I'm very susceptible to that kind of thing. I don't know if you are, but anyway, the war game group there, Solitaire War Games, is a good group, and they have often get this question: I'm starting in Solitaire War Games. What do you recommend? This is kind of a loaded question to ask a group of thousands of people, because you ask 100 people, what is a war game? You're going to get 100 different answers. Or is this a war game? You're going to get all kinds of different answers. You'll have, the more general and vague your question, the more different answers you're going to get, and that might be fine for you, but that's a lot to go through. I would propose there's an easier way to do it, and that is, we're kind of going into the next section here, which is to talk about just war games in general, and that is, what is your interest? If you asked me what Solitaire war games would I recommend, I'd have to come back to you and say, well, what do you like? Really, I mean, think about it. If you have no idea what you're doing, if you have no idea where to go or how to start, and you've not really thought about this before, sit down and write it out. Get a pad of paper, tap it out on your phone, something, and just kind of think about it. First, I would say, what is your favorite period of history? Because war games generally wrap themselves around that period, certain time periods of history, whether it's ancients, Romans, Napoleonic, Revolutionary War, Civil War, U.S. Civil War, English Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, modern combat, hypothetical stuff. There's all kinds of different areas to look at, and you need to think about that. What would you want to focus on? Now, it goes without saying, World War II is probably the biggest chunk, the hugest, isn't even a word, I was about to say that. Anyway, it's a big chunk of what war games are, and there's a lot of good classic ones in there. So that's probably, I'm guessing, where you would want to start. And if that's the case, then you're going to want to try to focus it down a little bit more. Like, is there a particular campaign? Is there a particular battle? Is there a particular aspect, like air power, sea power, land combat? You might not have even thought about these, and you might even think, I have no idea. Well, if you're a student of history, maybe you've read a few things about battles, and maybe some of them interest you, and that would be a good place to start. Maybe you're so brand new to it that you don't know what you like. And that's fine. And in which case, this is how I'm going to approach it too, is if you're somebody who's not played them before, you don't know what to expect, you don't know where to go, I've got a few ideas for you. Now, the first one is going to, and this is in no particular order either. The first one is going to be a series of games called Valiant Defense. They're by a designer named David Thompson, and by a company called DVG, or Danverson Games. They are absolutely fantastic for newcomers. I say that because they're easy to get into, they're easy to learn, and they're rich with history, and they're based on real battles. The first one, there's actually 4 right now. I'm not sure if he's working on the 5th. He might be. But the 4 that I know of, and I own all 4 of these, is Pavlov's House. Whenever somebody says, can you recommend a good solo war game for me, the first one I would say is go find Pavlov's House somewhere, because it's a great game. I say that because the Stalingrad campaign is, I've mentioned this before probably on the podcast, this is my favorite campaign. Now, I say favorite. I don't mean like, oh yeah, favorite campaign of people suffering, and I don't mean it like that. This is a game. We won't talk about that again. It's just a board game. It's paper. It's cardboard. There's no realism. There's no impacts in the world, but your imagination kind of makes that happen. And actually, that might be a good topic to discuss later. But for right now, it's one of my favorite to read about, to learn about, because it was such a titanic campaign, involved so much, and it was such a close-run thing on both sides. And it was the turning point of the war in Europe, too, which there were quite a few of those, but this was a big one. And Pavlov's House was kind of a microcosm of that entire battle. A small apartment complex that had commanding views of a large square, open area, could be used for artillery spotting, and the Germans wanted to take it badly. A very small group of Soviet soldiers fought the Germans and held them off for, I forget what it is, a month, 2 months, something like that. And the objective of this game is to just survive through a deck of cards that drives the enemy soldiers. And you're trying to manage your resources. You're trying to manage your soldiers. You're trying to manage the supplies. You're trying to manage the resources on the other side of the Volga River. We're talking anti-aircraft guns, communications, things like that. And all of this is tied together in this very unique and cool way. It's very easy, though. Don't sit there and think it's going to be overwhelming. It's not. It's so easy to learn and so much fun to play. Highly recommend it if you can do that. The other 3, we'll start with Castle Itter. That's Itter. And this one is fascinating to me because it's a Oh man, it's just a very unusual battle. It took place in late in the war in 1945 in Germany. I can't remember the details specifically about it, but like exactly what happened. But it was a group of Allied soldiers, U.S. soldiers. There were some civilians. There were some actual German soldiers as well that were all working together to defend this castle against attacks by elite German soldiers. And it's a real battle that really happened. And it's just fascinating to me that, that German soldiers would team up with American soldiers to fight off these fanatic German soldiers that just, would not give up and were determined to uphold their political leadership. And it's a fascinating battle. And it's different from Pavlov's house. There's mechanics to it that are different. And that's the thing about all four of these games. They're similar, but they each have their own unique aspects to it that make them different. It's not just the same old game, cookie cutter stamped to make a new one and with a new label and new cards and things like that. That's not how it works. That's not how David Thompson rolls. It's a good series. After that, you have Soldiers in Postmen's Uniforms, which details a very tragic yet very brave battle that Polish postal workers and civilians fought in defending a post office building against German assaults on the first day of the war on 1st September 1939. It's a very tragic story. I don't want to go into details here on this because it's beyond the scope, but if it's something you're interested in, go read about it. By all means, please read about it. The game itself, very well done. The fourth one is called Lanzereth Ridge, is I believe how you pronounce it, and it's based on a very small group of American soldiers, I think about a platoon size, fighting off large German elements during the Battle of the Bulge. And I actually own that game too. That's the only one of the four I haven't played yet. So I can't speak to it as to how good it is that I think personally. There's others out there that will tell you it's a great game, and I would totally agree to that. It's not going anywhere. I love his games, and that's all four of those are going to stay in my collection for as long as I can foresee the future. Those are really good titles. After that, it's really going to depend on taste. Those, if as a beginning wargamer you just want some place to start, that's a good place to go. After that, Greg Smith's designs. Greg Smith is a very prolific designer. He's got so many titles out there, and they're all really good. The ones I've played are really good. Some of them are large-scale strategic. Some are much smaller tactical. And again, it depends on your taste. So, that's another question besides thinking of what theater of conflict you want to learn more about, what period of history. Think about, too, what scale do you want? Do you want something world-changing, or you just want something tactical and small? So he does all kinds of different ones, such as Pacific Tide by Compass Games. I think a lot of his titles are Compass, but there's a few that are GMT. This particular one is a solo game where you are playing against the Japanese during World War II. As they encroach across the Pacific, you're trying to stop them. You're trying to manage your resources, including aircraft carriers, ships, soldiers, all this stuff. Really good game. I used to have it. I don't anymore. A lot of the games that I have and I've played, just because I don't have it anymore doesn't mean I don't like it. It's just because I have a huge collection and no room for a lot of things, so I often have to make very difficult decisions and cull my collection. But I can recommend that if you want to check that out. Also, he does a couple of games that are really cool that are based on air combat during World War II. One is called Interceptor Ace, and one is called Night Fighter Ace. Night Fighter Ace was the one I started with. It's very good. I enjoy it very much. You're playing as a German fighter pilot during World War II, but you're a night fighter pilot. So this was the burgeoning era. Well, World War II was in general, actually. A lot of technological advances were made during this conflict. I mean, things started out in 1939 and the way they turned out in 1945, 6 years of war, is unfortunate that that's what it takes to advance technology, but it's a fact. It's what happened. Going from propellers, biplanes to jet-powered aircraft, going from rockets that are, ground or air-to-surface rockets that are just kind of like firecrackers. They don't have guidance or anything, to actual rockets that were television guided. Germans created things like that. They didn't have the resources to make them mass production, thank goodness, but they were very innovative in some of the things they did. But Interceptor Ace and Night Fighter Ace are great. Interceptor Ace 2 is another one that's a sequel, which actually, I want to say it was created by a fan, or was an idea created by a fan, which Greg picked up on, and they created it together. I think I could be totally wrong about that, but it does do a lot of the later Wonder Weapon type of aircraft, like the Gotha 229 Flying Wing. Some of the other more advanced German jet aircraft are in that, because it's so I guess I should be more clear. Sorry. Interceptor Ace is more like 1942 to 43 to 44. I think it only takes place over a year or a little less than a year. Interceptor Ace 2 takes place after that, after the first one ends, so you can actually technically fly until the end of the war if you're lucky enough to survive. Your character, I should say. Those are two very good titles as well. There are a bunch of others. Those are Compass Games titles, as I said. And there's a bunch of others that Greg Smith did, such as GMT Games, The Hunters, The Hunted. Those are solo games where he plays a German U-boat commander. Silent Victory is another one, I believe. Let me double check that. It's called Silent Victory, U.S. Submarines in the Pacific, 1941 to 1945. That is indeed a Greg Smith design. It was originally published by Constant Press and then later by GMT, I believe. That is a great game where you're playing as a United States submariner. I believe he's working on another one where you play as a Japanese submariner, which is cool. Just from, looking at this conflict from multiple levels, it's really good. He also did a couple of really good designs. If you know of a classic game called B-17 Queen of the Skies, then I can talk a little bit about this. So that one is a classic game, very simple, very easy to get into, very much, as I discussed in the last episode, on rails, in that you've got charts. God, I said God. Ugh, I'm going to do that occasionally. I'll slip, sorry. You roll on one chart to roll on another to get results, and it's a narrative generator, and it's still one of the best, I think, just because that came out like in the 80s, man. That's a really good game, and I still have my copy after all these years. I still have it, and it's good. It's what Target for Today and Target for Tonight were based on. These are actually the same as B-17 Queen of the Skies, but, and it's a big but, they're much more detailed. They're on steroids, you could say. They're just these huge forces of nature, these games. They're very good as well. I can highly recommend them. Target for Today is where you play as an American bomber crew, and Target for Tonight is where you play as an British RAF bomber crew. And, during World War II, the Americans would bomb Germany during the day. The RAF, Royal Air Force, would do it at night. So you have two options. You can choose from or get them both. I've got them both. I played Target for Today. I haven't yet gotten to Target for Tonight. Those are good games too. Another company that I want to give a mention to is Hollandspiele. HOLLANDSPIELE. And if that's too much, and I said that too fast, there's a link in the description. So I got that going for me. All right. You're welcome. They do quite a few solo games. And the interesting thing about them is they are a print and play, or not print and play, sorry. Well, they might actually offer print and play, but they're a print on demand. That's what I wanted to say. A print on demand company, in that you order a game, it goes to a subsidiary place that prints the order for them. They print it up, package it, ship it to you. It's an actual physical copy of the game. A little box. Not a little box, but regular sized board game box, but it's a little bit thinner than your normal 2-inch, 3-inch board game boxes. Some of those are some of the best solo games I've ever seen and have played. So just to name a couple of them, Aurelian, Restorer of the World. It's a solo game where you play as the Roman Empire is broken. I'm looking at their page right now on this. The Roman Empire is broken. The crisis of the 3rd century, a decades-long fever dream of civil war, plague, and economic ruin stretched thinner and thinner. And in this game, it's a solitaire game by Tom Russell where you are playing to improve Roman rule. Charlemagne, Master of Europe. I believe that's something that Brandon talked about in a previous episode on this very podcast many episodes ago, but still I believe that was something he discussed. That's a good game. Let's see what else we got here. Escape from Hades. That's not really a war game, but it's a solo game in that you're playing the sci-fi game where you're trying to rescue prisoners on this alien planet. There's also one called Endurance, which is a really fascinating one that I have. It's not a war game, but it's a solo game of Antarctic survival based on Ernest Shackleton's famous 1914 expedition. That's an experience and a half, man. If you're interested in that kind of thing, go read about it. Again, not a war game. Sorry, I kind of went off the rails on that. But there are a few others that I could recommend highly. Let's see. NATO Air Commander. That was one of the first Hollandspiel games I ever got, and that's where you're playing as the NATO Air Commander in a hypothetical Warsaw Pact invasion of Europe. You are in charge of NATO's air resources, and you're trying to help stave off this invasion. And it's so difficult. I don't want to say it's difficult. It is difficult, but it's challenging. It's scary even to a point because you have so little to work with, and you're trying your best to hit them where they're weakest, where you can do the most good, where you can ensure your survivability. And that doesn't always help or happen, unfortunately. There's another one that I just received called That Others May Live. Again, war game? Well, perhaps. It's combat, search and rescue in Vietnam. So Air Force, Navy pilots would go in to bomb targets, and they'd often get shot down. I don't know how often, but it did happen, of course, and they would have to be rescued. So these guys would swoop in, try to locate them, and get them out before they were captured. And often when they would do that, the enemy would put anti-aircraft guns or missiles in place to kind of lure them in to shoot them down too and get even more prisoners. So this was kind of how it worked back then. This is a very challenging game from what I've seen. Not played it yet, really want to. But just to give you an idea, there's so many games here. If you go to Hollandspiel and then click all products, you'll get a list of every single title that they have. You can also click collections, and that'll give you access to every area that you might be interested in, like sci-fi, solo. They've got a dedicated solo section where you can look at every single solo title they own. So Hollandspiel, good system. So Hollandspiel, very good company as well, and pretty reasonably priced as well. GMT is another company I could talk about. They do quite a few great games, and they're good people too. This company is a big one, and they have a pretty good sized warehouse from what I understand. I've always wanted to go, but they do this thing called Weekend at the Warehouse twice a year where you can go play games with them, talk to them, learn about upcoming products, things like that. I've always wanted to go, but I've not had a chance to. I almost did last year, but I decided against it last minute just because it was an expense I couldn't really afford, unfortunately, but that's the way it goes. But GMT does quite a few solo games. Let me bring those up here so we can talk about them. Now, they do games that are probably more complicated, but these guys are the ones that have the titles that I already talked about, like what Greg Smith did. Sure. The Hunters, The Hunted, Beneath the Med, a few others that are really good in that regard. But there's others that are solo only that are good games, and you're just going to have to go over there and check them out. If you Google GMT games, you'll see it come up, but then you'll see some sub links that you can click, and one of them is Solitaire games. So if you click on that, you'll get every single solo game or every solo capable game that they have. Now, if I had to recommend anything out of there, that's a good thing. If you're a newcomer, I would say war game wise, that's a really good question, man. It's interesting that let's see. It's interesting to note that David Thompson is actually designing a game for them called Zhang He, and I might be pronouncing that wrong. I apologize if so. Admiral of the Ming Voyages. So this is a game about these voyages that these Chinese admirals did, or one did back in ancient times, thousands of years ago, they traveled all over the place, and it's kind of a surprise how far these guys actually went. So that's an interesting title to look at. It's not necessarily a war game, but more of a exploration game. But again, I did say I would talk about war games, and here I go talking about others that aren't. But they do ones like Skies Above the Reich, Storm Above the Reich. These are two that are fantastic solo games. I used to have Skies. I do not anymore. I do have Storm, and there's also Skies Above Britain. So there's 3 in this series. They're all solo. They're block games, but they're solo games. So you get to run a squadron of fighters in each of these. In Storm and Skies, you're playing as the Germans, and in Skies Above Britain, you're playing as the Royal Air Force. So those are great games. If you can go over there and you can eat the price tag, I recommend them wholly. Which one would I say would go for first? That's up to you. You know, which one appeals to you more? I would say go for it. Let's see. The coin games too. That is something I would recommend if you are a little more advanced in wargaming. Now, I don't mean like super advanced. If you're a newcomer even, you can still probably handle these if you're of a mindset to learn. And sometimes they can be a lot. The first one I started with was Fire in the Lake, which is about the Vietnam War. And now it has a couple of expansions to it, but I would say just look at the base game. And coin games are really good in that they're counterinsurgency. So they're not actual like war games where you're fighting like titanic struggles across a gigantic map. I mean, you are, but it's not like straight up combat. This is having to do with counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare, in which the Vietnamese excelled during the Vietnam conflict. We were trying to fight a conventional war, and they were not having that. So, you know, it's kind of along those lines where you're trying to use a square peg to fit into a round hole, I guess, and sometimes you're successful, sometimes you're not. It's just a matter of, you know, trying to plan things out, having the right amount of troops in the right place. It's a fantastic game, but it takes a lot of effort to learn it. Along those lines, you have some others, such as, Pendragon, which I think is probably the most complex out of all of them. I could be wrong, but that's my opinion. All Bridges Burning is another one. Andean Abyss is another one. Colonial Twilight. There's several in this series, coin games. You can find a list online if you want, but if you're interested in delving into that, I would say Colonial Twilight is probably the best one to start with because it's relatively easy to manage. The sides are smaller, the map is not huge, and coin games are great because they actually have bots that you can play against. But before you dive into one of these and play against bots, I recommend you play all sides. Play all sides, play it multi-handed. That way you're learning, because each side usually has some kind of special ability or abilities that are unique to them, and you might not get a really good feel for this unless you play it multi-handed. That way you're learning the game, and then you can play the bots, and then you'll know, okay, this makes sense. It'll all fall into place. Trust me on that. So give that a try. They also do a couple of really good titles. Enemy Coast Ahead. One is called the Dam Buster Raid, and the other is called the Doolittle Raid. So the Dam Buster Raids were these raids in Western Germany during World War II to bomb dams, obviously to blow them up because they could be used for hydroelectric power and to power the local factories. And taking them out would help remove that as a source of electricity, but it would also flood a lot of the low-lying areas, cause the Germans endless trouble. That's the Dam Buster Raids. Enemy Coast Ahead, the Doolittle Raid is, of the two, I would say I would recommend that the most because it's so rich. It tells a story that's fantastic, and that's of the Doolittle Raid, which was where we launched B-24 bombers off of aircraft carriers hundreds of miles east of Japan, and you might have heard of this, maybe not, where these bombers bombed Japan and then went on to China, and they weren't always successful. A lot of them were. When I say successful, I mean a lot of them didn't always navigate properly, didn't get to where they needed to go. They were running low on fuel. They launched early because of that, because they were spotted by a trawler, and they wanted to be sure that there wasn't word of warning getting back. So it's this whole thing where you're starting as from the beginning where the raid's being planned, and then you go through training, and then you go to actually moving your fleet across the ocean, and then trying to decide when will you strike. The closer you get, the more chance there is of being discovered. It's just this whole tense thing going on, and then you launch your strike finally, and they have to navigate to the targets, they have to hit them, and then you have to get them, the crews, to safety. So it's this whole thing, and it teaches the game very well in that it focuses just on one part of it, which is the raid itself, and then it grows it from there. So you first learn how to do that. Okay, I got it. Move to the next one where it expands it a little bit and gives you more things to learn about and more things to play, more concepts to add to the game, and builds it until you can play the entire thing. So that's great. There's one more series that I would like to recommend for GMT, but that's only if you're an advanced player, and that would be Fields of Fire. Fields of Fire 1 or 2. Now, these are incredibly complex, but everybody I've ever heard talk about them loves them to death, thinks they're fantastic, thinks they're well worth the effort to learn. So there you go. I would say that's online with another game called Combat with an exclamation point from Compass. And I've got the first version of that as well. That's got a volume 2 as well. But the first one I've not played it yet because it's so big and complex. I've just not done it yet. I used to have Fields of Fire. I finally sold it. I really didn't want to. One of my culling of my collections ended up going out the door. So, and you might think, oh, he's not recommending it because he got rid of it. I'm not going to buy that. And it's up to you. If you're at a point where you feel you're ready for it, that I think is the penultimate solo war game, but it's tactical combat of infantry combat during World War II. See, there's so many other companies, there's so many other games I can talk about, and I think I'll talk about some classic games that I've used to play that really got me going into this hobby. Your mileage may vary with these, meaning you might not find them anywhere for less than several $100s each. It's kind of a funny thing. The prices that some of these games commandeer these days, or command, I should say. Commandeer too, if you give them the cash, I guess. They're fantastic games, but your mileage again will vary because if you're getting into the hobby now, you're used to a certain production quality. Games that were games that were made back in the early 80s especially, or heck, the late 70s, 60s even, before my time, but it's the quality has improved greatly since then, but that doesn't mean they're bad. One in particular I would say, and it stands out among all the rest, is called Ambush with an exclamation point. So if you go to BGG, search for that, you'll see the base game. You'll also see three expansions: Move Out, Silver Star, and Purple Heart. There was also a magazine, I believe, that had one mission in it. There's some other aspects to it, like I believe there's a company that sells an upgraded version of the combat cards, which I have too, of course. It's a good game in that it's all paragraph driven. You start by building your squad out. You actually get a certain number of squad points and a certain number of weapons points, and you spend those to build your squad. And of course, you're going to want a squad leader who's really good. You're going to want a second in command who's probably pretty good. And so by the time you get down to your 6th, 7th, 8th soldier, you're having issues with the number of points you have left. They're not probably going to be as good as the others, but so you can't build an elite squad right off the bat. You have to, pick and choose and kind of give and take. Same with weapons. You can give your squad leader a submachine gun and a bunch of ammo and, add a bazooka in there maybe if you have enough squad points, weapon points, satchel charges, ammo for all of this. Like I said, it's all built into the game system. So you build out your squad and then you start the mission, and it tells you which hexes, and that's what it is, a hex map, where you can enter. It tells you vaguely what or maybe not sometimes vaguely, but it does tell you specifically what your goal is, but this can change through the game. You start with this paragraph sleeve that has little holes cut out in it, and you insert a card. This big card is like an 8.5 by 11 size card. And when you move a soldier into a hex, like say hex A1, then you look up A1 and line it up in this card sleeve, and the little window will tell you if there's a number or not. So if it says NA, or I think it says NA for nothing, then nothing happens and everything's fine. But then sometimes it has a paragraph number, and you flip to the paragraph number and you follow the instructions, and sometimes it's a German activates, or it tells you to make a perception check or something like that. So it adds this fantastic amount of storytelling and narrative to the game. And that's across, I think the base game has 8 missions, and the expansions have 4 to 6. I want to say. It's been a while. I own all of these, of course, and it's funny. I had the game back in the 80s, and then I ended up selling it before I moved in the late 2010s, and I regretted that immensely, and I managed to get my hands on some copies through trade, slowly but surely, until I have them all. So if you can ever get a hold of this, well, let me say, I'd rather say look into it some more. Go to BGG, look at some videos, see what you think before you go and try to spend money on this, because it's a lot of money. There's another version of this. This game was so successful that they did another version for Pacific Combat, where you're running a squad of Marines, and it's called Battle Hymn. That's HYMN. And that actually did well enough that they created one expansion called Leatherneck. So, based on the nickname for Marines. So that's a good one too, in and of itself. It's a little more suited, I think, to this, because you're landing on a beach, you're trying to push inland, and you're dealing with snipers, you're dealing with caves that are strong points, you're dealing with all this stuff. So it's a good game. It tells a great story. It's somewhat complex to learn, just because there's initiative, and there's a whole thing with initiative where you're basically, when you go into combat rounds and you're fighting the enemy, you've got certain soldiers can act first, Marines, depending on which game you're playing, and then the enemies. It got to a point where I was just, okay, I when I was a teenager, I don't want to learn this. Initiative out the window. I'm going to play it the way I want to play it. So, all 8 of my characters would go, then all the enemy would go, then my guys would go, then back and forth is the way I did it, which is not technically how you're supposed to play it, but do your thing, right? Make your game your own. That's the thing about this solo hobby. I see some people sometimes ask, hey, can I do this? Is this right? Can I do that? Well, if it feels right, do it. I mean, I understand wanting to play the game right, but sometimes it's a question that's more along the line of taste, or more along the line of expectation, or how you perceive things. And, hey, if you think it's cool, do it. Have fun with it. That's the whole thing. You spend a lot of money on this game, do it. So those are the Ambush series of games. Another one that I really have enjoyed is called Mosby's Raiders. And it's a solo game where you are a Confederate cavalryman during the U.S. Civil War. You're trying to slow down the Northern advance, and by causing problems in the rear. Let's just say you're tearing up train tracks, you're kidnapping generals and colonels, you're destroying depots, you're having combat too occasionally when you get caught. And the game starts, I love it because it's got this growth of threat. So you start off as a nobody. Nobody knows who you are. The North doesn't know who you are. But as you succeed, you build notoriety. And once you get to a certain level, the Union Northern soldiers, or Northern Command rather, starts adding more soldiers to the mix to try to stop you. The more successful you are, the more challenging it becomes, but also, by the same token, the stronger you become, because you attract more followers, you attract better weapons, you get better gear, this kind of thing. And I've always liked it for that, because this threat level kind of grows, and it's your game to win or lose, basically. But it's always this push your luck element too. It's like, how far behind the lines do I go? Do I dare blow up this depot, which is right next to this large Union force? Do I want to kidnap this general? He's way up there in Washington, D.C. Do I want to risk sending my whole band up there to do this? It causes you to ask all kinds of hard questions, and that's why I like about it. So that's another good one. Another classic one that I've always enjoyed is by Decision Games. Actually, two. By Decision Games. The first is called RAF, The Battle of Britain. the decision the Decision Games version is the newer one. It came out, I don't know, 8 years ago. I could be totally wrong about that, but something like that. It is a great game because you can play the Battle of Britain, which was 1940, summer of 1940-ish, as the RAF, Royal Air Force, or as the Germans. So if you're playing either side, it's a challenge, but it's such a good challenge, and it's such an easy system to learn, especially if you play it from the RAF side, because that's the original game came out, I want to say in the 80s, and I had it back then, and I loved it to death. It's such a good game, such fun, such tenseness, such enjoyment, such a big thing that was just based, this threat of the Germans conquering England, that would start there with the Battle of Britain, with the Germans trying to win air superiority over southern England, and if they had done it, that they might have invaded England. And the game makes no bones about it. If you don't do well, then they will do that, and you lose the game. But being able to play this version from both sides, that is great. I love it for that reason. So it gives you two perspectives, and you're managing resources. Your pilots get worn out. You have fighter losses. You're trying to replace those. It's just this game where you're just having to consider all these factors to try to win for your side. That's a really good one. The other one by Decision Games that I enjoy greatly is D-Day at Omaha or D-Day at Tarawa. Now there's others. D-Day at Pelu, I believe, and D-Day at Iwo Jima. Those two are a little more complex. I would say if you want to start with one, go with either one of these other two. When you open these games up, you're going to be like, what have I gotten myself into? These maps look so confusing. But once you learn the game and once you get into it, it makes total sense, because all these dots, all these symbols, all these icons on the map, it looks like a mess, but it's not. Once you realize what you're looking at, it's sort of like that scene from the Matrix movie where they're looking at it and he's like, oh, I don't see code, I see pictures, I see what's going on. That's kind of the way this goes too. I like both of these games. Tarawa, the Battle of Tarawa, or BTO, it's spelled BETIO, I believe. But this particular title is D-Day at Tarawa, Tarawa. It's a very good game. It's very focused. It's very difficult. It's very tough to win. So they're very challenging. They're card driven. You get certain resources. You got your men coming in, landing on the beach, and you're trying to move them inland to achieve objectives. Very difficult game to do. And as I'm thinking of that, I'm thinking of another game, not by Decision Games. This one is, Herman Lettman is another legend in the solo wargaming community. This guy's done several great games, two of which I can think of off the top of my head that mean something dear to me, and one is In Magnificent Style. So I believe the first one came out with Victory Point Games, which is no longer a thing, unfortunately. It was picked up and redone by another company. Worthington Publishing is who did it. And I had to double check that because I wanted to say Worthington, but I didn't want to say the wrong thing in case you go looking for it. Worthington picked it up, redid everything, made the map bigger, made the components bigger. They pop, they look great. It's a fantastic game. It's a solo game where you control Pickett's charge, which technically isn't who charged, but it was another main division. I mean, Pickett was part of it, but there was another Confederate division that was the main thrust of the rebel attack on Union lines at the Battle of Gettysburg on day 3. If you're not familiar with Pickett's charge, a very horrific thing. All these rebel soldiers charging Union lines, they got completely beaten back, and the Northern Bluecoats were shouting Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg at them, because there was a very similar battle previously that you can look up to read more about, where the tables were turned. The Southerners did that to the Northerners when the Northerners charged their lines at Fredericksburg, and it was kind of payback of sorts. But it was also the high water mark of the Confederacy, and they never achieved anything further after that. I mean, there were several battles and several years of war to fight after that, but this particular battle was like the crux. It was like the point of the high point of the Southern campaign. So you're fighting as the Southerners trying to breach the Union lines, and it's brutal. It's so difficult to do, but it's an enjoyable game where you got some push your luck elements to it, managing resources, trying your best to carry the field. I think I've won once out of all the times I've played it, and that's saying something. I'm very proud of having won the game once. Another of his designs that I really enjoy is called Crowbar, and it's about the U.S. Rangers assaulting Crowbar, the Rangers at Point du Hoc, I believe it's called. So that is a actual attack that took place on D-Day, June 6, 1944, where United States Rangers assaulted these German gun positions, but they had to climb these cliffs that were 100, 120 feet tall. First they had to land, then they had to scale these cliffs, then they had to assault the Germans and their guns and take the guns because they would have otherwise been used against U.S. landings. So, and caused a lot of casualties. So this was a very important raid. Another great design by him. He's done several other titles. Off the top of my head, I believe he did, Dawn of the Zeds. There's one. I actually own that one. The latest version of it, 3rd edition, I believe it is. That's a classic zombie game, and it's got a lot of battle in it. So if that's something you're into, you like zombies, you like battle, see if you can find a copy of it for inexpensive. He's also done several others, like the Escape from Hades, which I mentioned was a Hollenspiel title. He did that. So, I could go, like I said, this is a rabbit hole. I could keep going on and on and on about this and talking about all these wonderful solo war games. The concepts behind them are so different too, and that's something that I've purposefully avoided talking about. I've mentioned it a few times, like card play, hex encounter, that kind of a thing, paragraph-driven stuff. That's a conversation I'm going to get into with others when I get into the other second and third parts of this conversation. For now, we're pushing an hour right now. It's just over. After editing, it's probably going to be about that. So I'm going to go ahead and say thank you for listening to this episode of the Solosaurus podcast, number 90. I want to thank you guys for listening. Thanks again to Martin Gonzalez for taking care of the logistics behind the scenes. And thanks to my upcoming sponsor, I suppose. I'm looking at just a little bit more on that. I'm looking to get somebody to provide the podcast with a game once a month, which I think will happen. After that, I'm thinking, instead of just letting these things pile up, I might start giveaways at some point if I can figure out how to do that. I'm sure you guys would not mind that at all, getting free games from us. There's so many of you too. I think that would be a good thing to try to do. So look forward to that. It might not be in the next episode, but I'm going to plans on trying to get that implemented before the end of the year at some point, so I can start giving some things away and start getting you guys more involved with that. So I can pass on games that I review. They're going to be used copies, but they're going to be well loved. Trust me, they're going to be good, taken care of well. So it's not like I'm going to just hand you hand-me-downs that have been through the ringer. So there's that. So thank you again for listening to this podcast. As I said, there will be continuation of this, a part 2 where I talk to another solo gamer journalist, and then a third part where I will talk to an actual solo game designer. And we'll talk more about these concepts and probably go down our own rabbit holes there. So the next episode is going to be a game review, I promise. I've already talked in general in the last episode, talked in general here about so many games. I've got to make a list of all these and put links to BGG so you can find them more easily. So thanks for paying attention. Thanks for listening. Thanks for engaging. I appreciate it. Head on over to, like I said, to Facebook and join the group. And if you haven't, and Instagram, I've actually started to kind of do things there, not a lot, because Instagram is kind of this thing that scares me a little bit, I have to say. I posted 2 pictures, I think, and the second one I think messed up and I didn't send it to the right place. I'm trying, man. I'm trying. But yeah, join us over there. Send me an email at solosauruspodcast@gmail.com if you've got games you're interested in me covering. There are things I can discuss with the upcoming sponsor. We'll find a place for it at some point in the process. I'm looking at doing maybe at least 2 episodes per month. So if I'm provided with a board game from the sponsor once per month, I might get another sponsor to provide another game, or just go to publishers or designers. I've got plenty of those, as I said, to cover. So I'm looking, if I do 2 to 3 episodes a month, I should be pretty well covered there. So All right, I've babbled enough. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for listening. I will see you in the next episode.